Hello everyone, I'm Colin Cadet. Today's video is based on my research for people who have studied the safety of cutting boards, combined with my knowledge of woodworking and what you can do to make the safest cutting boards you can. So let's have a look. So number one, what woods can I use? Well, in North America, you can use any hardwood or softwood that you want. Softwood cutting boards will need to be replaced a little bit more often, but that's a good thing because all of the studies tell us that we should be replacing cutting boards more often because of the buildup of bacteria that happens in the knife cuts. Of the hardwoods, oak is one of the best because it has tannins, and tannic acid is a natural antimicrobial agent. The woods you want to avoid are the exotic oily woods, and that includes the Northern Hemisphere cedars, particularly Western red cedar. The problem with these woods is they don't glue permanently very well. You can use acetone on them to take away the oiliness from them, but that's only a temporary fix because the oils always migrate to the surface and they will debond over time, and before they do that they create cracks because they will debond in little areas first of all, and when they create cracks, that's an area for pathogens like microorganisms, bacteria and so on to collect, and that's not a good thing in a cutting board. Tip number two is use the fewest number of joints that you can get away with. And the fewer the better. And the reason for that is every time you have a joint, you have an opportunity for that joint to either not be glued properly or for that joint to come apart in some way. Maybe it's the wood that twists or does something after it's been glued up. It can happen, and it does happen. Now, I know there's lots of people out there that are making edge grain cutting boards, and you know what? These are gorgeous cutting boards, but look at all of the possible joints that there are in these. I've long said these edge grain cutting boards should never be used as a cutting board. They're kitchen art. They should remain as kitchen art, as a platter, as a display, as something, because who wants to destroy a beautiful edge grain cutting board by cutting things on it? And as it turns out, common sense tells us that when you have more joints, you have more risk of things getting in. And even to the point where wood, sometimes you cut into a board and there's defects inside that board, and all of those create problems. Any place there's an area for bacteria to get into a cutting board, little holes, little etches, it will do that. So you really want to have the fewest number of joints that you can get away with. So the bacteria that they're usually concerned about on cutting boards, things like E. coli, salmonella, listeria, those are pretty serious pathogens, and people die from those. And you wonder, well, if there is a little crack in there, so what? How does that get up there? Well, let me show you how it gets up there. And that is when you're cutting something and maybe there's a little bit of juice there, a little bit of water, a little bit of moisture, pretty common even when you're cutting vegetables. And the next thing you do is you take that and lift that off, and that moisture may have got into a crack, and now you're lifting that up, and it might be with a knife, maybe you're scraping or cutting, lifting with a knife. Those are ways that bacteria can lift up, and that's how they test to see what's on a cutting board is doing exactly what I showed you, using it in sort of a live situation. And that's why we want to reduce all of these joints. So here's a mock-up cutting board that I made, and this black line that you're seeing in here is actually a glue joint. Let me show you how I made this. Okay, so there you can see the results. That black line is actually a glue joint. And if that were a line, you can see over here where this wood is two different woods glued together here, and you can't see that glue joint in there. You can see the different woods, but you can't actually see that glue joint. But if you have a cutting board and you can see a black line like that, and that tells me that joint is failed partially. There is no glue in there, and what's happening is you're getting bacteria and things in there, molds and who knows what in there, and that's what that black line is. If you have a cutting board that has a black line on it, then you should either throw it out, or the other thing you could do, you might be able to salvage it by cutting that out and re-gluing back together, but at this point you're probably best to throw it out. No matter what your choice in cutting boards, tip number 3, making a cutting board should be the messiest woodworking you will ever do. And what I mean by that is you want squeeze out of glue on every joint, because if you don't get squeeze out, there's a risk that you're going to have a void. And as we've already talked about repeatedly, voids are places where you can get bacteria in. So when you're making a cutting board, you should have squeeze out on every joint, front and back. It's going to be the messiest thing that you want to do. So lots of glue and lots of squeeze out, regardless of the type of glue that you're using. Tip number 4, never use wood with knots, cracks, splits, any kind of a defect. That is a place that you're going to have problems with bacteria getting into. And I know that some people are going to say, well, you could use CA glue in there. You can use CA glue in there, but I don't like that, and I'll tell you why. CA glue is typically very brittle. And what happens is eventually you're going to hit that with a knife. You're going to break part of it away. You may not even notice it. I'm not concerned about maybe it gets into your food because, again, you know, it's like popcorn or peanuts or walnuts. It doesn't typically stay in you. But what happens is now you may not have noticed that now you've opened up yet another crack because your CA glue has failed in that little bit of an area. So lots of great places to use CA glue, but I would not use CA glue on a cutting board because it may not be a permanent solution. Tip number 5 is, of course, food-safe coatings. And boy, don't we as woodworkers fluster over food-safe coatings on cutting boards. And I hear a lot of people say, oh, you shouldn't use vegetable oil because it goes rancid. Yeah, it does go rancid if you take the lid off and you use a little bit and you don't use it for 4 years. But I've never heard of vegetable oil getting rancid on a cutting board. And if you have vegetable oil getting rancid on a cutting board, you probably have bigger problems going on because it means you haven't cleaned that cutting board in 3 or 4 years. But look, you can put, there's a variety of things that you can put on a cutting board. Beeswax, this isn't beeswax, but so there's beeswax. You can use mineral oil. There's special products that you can buy to put on, sesame oil, walnut oil, all sorts of different things that you can put on. And they say the reason that you put this on is to seal the wood. And I don't really know what that means, because when you, anything that you put on, you're basically going to be wiping it off. By the end of 2 weeks, whatever you put on there, if you've been cleaning your cutting board the way it should be, with, you know, periodically with soap and water, and then letting it dry, probably the most important thing you can do. Wash it with warm soapy water, rinse it, and then let it dry. And that is what kills more of the bacteria and pathogens than anything. So this may arguably be the safest cutting board that you can make. It's a single piece of oak. That means it's naturally antimicrobial, antibacterial. It has a handle, which means that if your hands are contaminated with something, it's not necessarily going to get onto the cutting board. It also means that you can pick up the whole thing and take it over to the stove if that's what you're doing, cutting up vegetables, for example. It's nice and thick, which means you can take it to your workshop and run it through your planer until it gets so thin that you can't run it through anymore. It's a single piece, and that means there's no no places for glue joints to fail. And if you did get cracks in the end, because it's just a single piece of oak, you would just dispose of it and make a new one. Quick and simple and safe. During this video, I had to make a number of cutting boards, and I have wider cuts sometimes than what my sliding miter would do. And a number of months ago, I made this jig just for doing cross cuts, wider cross cuts on the table saw. And honestly, I use this thing way more than the miter gauge on my table saw. It's quick, it's accurate, it's very easy to make. It might be something you want to have a look at. I'm Colin Canet for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching.